Welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On today's show, we have much to get to.
Great!
Author J.D. Horn is here to tell us about his new book, The King of Bones and Ashes. Now, I'm reading this one now, and I love it. It's all about the witches of New Orleans. Also, we have a story from Aaron, who just happens to be from New Orleans.
Amazing!
Yeah, it really is. Now, wouldn't it be great if our 5-minute mystery was also in New Orleans?
Yes, that would be something.
Well, it's not, but here it is anyway.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is all about telling the truth. If you never lie, it's much easier to remember what you said. If you experience an event, you're more likely to remember it. It only makes sense. Now, let's put this into action.
Hello? Croydon, this is Mike Davis, editor of the Herald.
Your paper's not supporting me for re-election as district attorney. If you want an interview, you're out of luck.
I want an interview, all right, but it's nothing to do with the election. Someone broke into my home tonight and stole some valuable evidence against Rocky Marino that I was going to turn over to you tomorrow.
What sort of evidence?
Enough of the kind to send Marino to the chair.
Great Scott, Davis. If I could do that, I'd win the election hands down.
Don't let my publisher know, or I'll be looking for a new typewriter. You better come over here right away. My secretary got a look at the man who broke open my safe.
Right away, Davis. This is the break I've been looking for.
This is Miss Mitchell, my secretary.
Can you tell me exactly what happened here tonight, Miss Mitchell?
I knew about the evidence Mr. Davis had against Marino, of course, and I came here tonight to retype the case summary that Mr. Davis had prepared.
Yes, Croydon, I had been working on this exposé for several months. Tonight it was to be finished. Tomorrow you would have been handed the election on a silver platter.
We've got to recover those papers.
I know what the thief looked like.
Excellent. Now, please proceed.
He was rather a tall man. He walked with a limp. The strange part of it is that he didn't wear a hat.
What was the color of his hair?
To tell the truth, I didn't notice. There wasn't too much light in the room.
Where were you when all this eyewitness stuff was going on, Miss Mitchell?
Well, I had just opened the wall safe here when I heard muffled footsteps in the hall. I knew it couldn't be Mr. Davis, as he had just phoned me a minute or two before that.
That's right, Croydon.
I just had time to push the safe door shut and run behind the sofa there when he came in.
Did he go directly to the safe?
Yes, I didn't have time to shove the picture back over it. I was afraid to show my face too much, so I stayed hidden most of the time behind the couch.
How long did you have to stay there?
Oh, he worked on the safe about 20 minutes. Then he finally got it open, took out the papers, and ran out.
I say. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, how long have you worked for Mr. Davis?
About a year. Why?
Because you're out of a job. Your story is nothing but a pack of lies.
What flaws in Miss Mitchell's story caused the district attorney's suspicion? In a moment we'll know, but first...
He said it. It's all been a pack of lies. But which ones? Who is she working for, and why? Do you think we'll get the answers we seek? Nah, probably not. But I have to be honest and say, I thought her story was pretty good. What do you say we head back and see what the DA has figured out?
And now, back to our story.
But I told you the truth, Mr. Croydon.
Then how do you explain the inconsistencies in your story? First you told me the thief walked with a limp, and then you told me he ran from the room. But the big lie in your fairy tale, Miss Mitchell, came when you said you just had time to push the safe door shut and then hide behind the couch. If that was so, the thief never would have had to work 20 minutes to open the safe. It never could have been locked. No safe locks unless the combination is turned or a key is used. Come on, Davis. You've got a front-page story on my re-election as soon as Miss Mitchell returns the evidence.
Well, her timings were off. She forgot to mention she had time to jumble the combo, and well, she did just tell us a whole pack of lies, which proves my point. If only she had told the truth. Oh, wait. She kind of had to lie, didn't she? So, unless you're a criminal, you should always tell the truth. Words to live by.
What's that you say?
Did you know about the brand new Ron's Amazing Stories Amazon Echo skill? This one, I think, just might put the podcast in front of a brand new audience. I can't begin to tell you how happy I am to be one of the few that have had their show put there. This is a program offered by my service provider, Liberated Syndication. They are the best podcast provider in the business since 2005. To activate the skill on your Echo, simply say, Nexa. Activate Ron's Amazing Stories. Yeah, I said Nexa, so I wouldn't activate your Echo. Ron's Amazing Stories is also an on-air radio show. We are on every Sunday night, 8 p.m. Pacific. Now, I'm going to be making some changes to the radio show, and I'm going to tell you more about that later on. So to be clear, though, Ron's Amazing Stories is on Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Pacific, that's 11 p.m. Eastern. For more information and stations in your area, head to amfm247.com. And now for the main event. A few weeks ago, I was contacted by a publicist about a relatively new and successful author. I was told he was quite good and would be a perfect fit for the show. I get a lot of these, and quite frankly, who are they to know what fits? Well, as it turns out, Darlene was right, and so, on the podcast this week, we have author J.D. Horn. He'll be talking about his new book, The King of Bone and Ashes. J.D. hails from rural Tennessee and has since carried a bit of its red clay with him while traveling the world from Hollywood to Paris to Tokyo. He studied comparative literature as an undergrad, focusing on French and Russian in particular. He holds an MBA in international business and has worked as a financial analyst before giving it all up and becoming a novelist. He has racing bibs from 2 full marathons and about 30 half marathons. J.D. has written the highly successful and Wall Street Journal best-selling series of books, the Witching Savannah series. His new series, The Witches of New Orleans, is a hit and is a personal favorite with me. It is with great pleasure I welcome to the show Mr. J.D. Horn. Welcome to the podcast, J.D.
Thank you.
I always like to start with things in common, and the one thing that I could come up with is that, obviously, we both love fantasy.
Oh, true.
Are your books considered fantasy, or are they put into a separate genre?
Well, they're in a few different buckets because, when you talk about genre, you're really talking about what marketing people are doing to try to make it easier for readers to find what they're looking for. But yeah, my books are considered contemporary fantasy. The first series is more moving towards urban fantasy with tinges of horror. The new series is much more contemporary/dark fantasy/horror, so they kind of live around that area.
What is the difference between typical fantasy and dark fantasy? Is it just that the mood is darker, or is there something that categorizes it that way?
Well, I think that with dark fantasy, it tends to go much closer to horror. it's sort of a more horrific type of violence to them, a darker kind of feel to the story, maybe a little bit less humor, although sometimes there can be some really dark and twisted humor in it too. It's in a lot of ways, it's kind of subjective. And I personally think of what I'm doing as kind of like horror with a happy ending, because I've heard horror defined as, it's defined, quite often as a lack of hope. And I so need to look that up because I keep paraphrasing the person who said it, but I need to find the actual quote. I'm not sure that's the total complete definition of horror, but from my viewpoint, what I do is it doesn't lack hope. My characters, I take them to incredibly dark places, but I usually bring them back. It's not like true horror where they're left stranded in the middle of some terrible experience. I always kind of pull them back and welcome them back to my arms.
Well, let's take a minute here and talk about the J.D. Horn story. How did you get into writing? What is it that made you become an author?
Well, I was one of those really geeky, very small children. I wanted to, before I could write, I was scribbling on pieces of paper and telling people to read my story. And of course, they'd stare at me blankly and like, well, okay, these aren't words, and that still kind of happens to me with my editors sometimes. But, I always wanted to be a storyteller. And so by the time I was in high school, I had started writing a first novel. It was very much a genre work, kind of going towards horror already then. But I went to college, and I don't know why, instead of going into the creative writing group, I decided to make comparative literature my undergraduate major. And within 3 months or so, 4 months of reading the classics by the people I like to think of as the dead white guys, I decided that I would never be a writer. I would never be a Dostoevsky. I would never be a Tolstoy. I would never, be any of the big names. And so I thought, I can't do this. I won't do this. So I threw out my manuscript, what I had at that point, and I did not try to write again until the 90s when I discovered Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City. And what inspired me by those books is that he deals quite often with heavy issues, but he does it using mystery and humor, and so it can be like a very light touch to a very dark or heavy subject. And I thought, this is what I want to do, and that's what inspired me to start writing then. And I tell some people sometimes I'm an overnight success story that was like 20-something years in the making, because I wrote my first novel in the 90s. I spent like a year and a half, 2 years trying to get an agent, trying to find a publisher, and the whole experience was so just horrible, so depressing, so humiliating. I quit. I just thought, I'm not going to try to be a published author anymore. And instead, I focused on my finance career. And it was only years later, after I met my to-be spouse at that point, his father was a writer. He wrote short stories and a novel. And he was talking about his father. I said, I wrote a novel once. And Rich encouraged me to pull it out, brush it off, and try again. And this time, 20 years later, it got me an agent, but we still couldn't sell it. We got rejections back. I mean, she didn't take it to a lot of editors, but the one she did, 6 editors, 3 of them sent me really great notes saying, we like this story, we like the character, we like your writing, but we can't sell it. This is what we can sell. This is what, if you write this, and they literally gave me bullet points on some of them. If you write this story will sell. And I thought, I can either be really horribly depressed for another decade, or I can take those notes and see what I can come up with. And I took those notes, and from those notes, I wrote the line. It came out 4 years ago, and it just keeps going. It's amazing. It's like, I'd like to think it was a little book that could. It's been translated into 7 languages so far.
Yes.
And it's been an amazing experience for just a little, what I thought maybe it would sell at most a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand copies. It's, I have people from Poland writing me now, it's great. So it's been a wonderful experience.
Doing some of the research on you, one of the things I noticed is you were focused on both French and Russian. Did you focus your books on that languages? Did you use those?
My French was in the original version. The Russian was in translation. And I must admit, my school did not offer Russian to begin with. And so I had one professor there who spoke Russian, and I tried to do a tutorial with him to learn some Russian. And I am just not smart enough to handle that language. Okay, so the French was the original version. The Russian, I could never get there. So it's like, it was a hopeless case.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because I have been reading through your books, and I noticed just the tone, the way you write is just, it's unique. And I was trying to figure out why that was. And I thought maybe it was because of the fact that you studied comparative literature or something. I was trying to find a reason. Do you think about that when you write? Do you think about, how can I say this to make it more impactful? Or is it just natural?
A little bit of both. I think that when you study comparative literature, part of what you're doing when you study literature in general is you're learning how to read and how to read for subtext, how to read for metaphor, how to read for, anything that's underlying that you might be able to tickle out. And so when I write, I try to put those little, what that we would call kind of almost Easter eggs now in what I'm writing, where if you can read the story at one level, but if you start looking even just a little beneath the surface, you'll see I'm actually telling a different story.
Exactly.
And so while I'm talking about witches and magic and things like that, I'm actually talking about, in my books, both series, magic is sort of, as I say, I hate to be pretentious metaphor guy, but I just learned that I have to own the fact that I'm a pretentious metaphor guy. So, I celebrate my pretentious metaphor guyness. But it's it's a metaphor for privilege. Magic is, I'm using it as a metaphor for privilege. And part of what you see, especially in this new series, is that the characters are having to acknowledge where their powers have given them the upper hand, and what they're going to do. How they're going to continue, knowing sort of who they are and what they've come from. So I do think there's just sort of like a subconscious level of it too, because once you have the hard wiring put in your head, you start doing things without really necessarily thinking about it. But yeah, no, I love referring to mythology. I'll toss in like little references to, fairly commonly known books or characters or things from time to time just for fun, Although I've gotten truly horrible. I'm doing what I call doing a David Lynch, because my theory about David Lynch is that he throws in so many different kind of allusions to mythology and other forms of literature, and he's doing it as a red herring. He does it to get your brain to start triggering to say, this is where the story's going, this is where the story's going, just so he can move it. He's misdirecting. And I must admit, I've gotten quite, I've come to enjoy doing that myself lately. So in the new series, you'll see a lot of references to Alice, who's one of the main characters. She's the first point of view character we meet, and to mirrors and to a non-reality land. But I'm not, it's just a trick to get you to think about Lewis Carroll. Maybe this is spoiler, but I don't really take you there. But I like building expectations. So you're going, you're looking for that aha of like, oh, I saw this coming all along. And then you're like, oh my God, where did that come from?
Another thing that I found out about you is that you're a world traveler. Do you like to visit the places that you write about, or do you write about the places you visit?
A little bit of both. Sadly, my world traveling has been mostly in my younger days, but I'm just now, starting to travel around the world again. So I've recently been to Israel. I'm going to Italy next month, and we've got a few other things that are lining up. So I'm very excited to actually be going places again. But I do a lot of research on the places I write about, and I go there quite often. I talk to people. I walk around. I basically listen to how people are talking. I'm a terrible eavesdropper. I eavesdrop on everything. So if you ever see somebody sort of sitting next to you and kind of like typing away and kind of glancing over at you, it's probably me. I try to really get the spirit of a place and do my interpretation of it. The first series, the Witching Savannah series, obviously is set in Savannah, and I do love Savannah. But Savannah, in many ways, is much easier to write than New Orleans, because Savannah basically tells two, maybe three stories about itself, and people are kind of unified in how they view Savannah and what they talk about, the stories they tell about themselves. When it comes to New Orleans, though, New Orleans, first of all, that city screams write me more than any other city I've ever seen. My entire adult life, I wanted to go to New Orleans. And everyone I know, people who know me really, really well, and not just one, I'm talking dozens of people would say, you'll hate New Orleans. Don't waste your time going to New Orleans. New Orleans is not for you. Okay, there was a convention in New Orleans, part of the Tennessee Williams Festival, and I went to that. And I was in New Orleans, I think about 17 and a half seconds before I'm like, oh, my heavens, I love this place. I love this place. And it just, it's every corner, every angle you look at that city, it screams Rightney. But it tells you so many different stories. And people who live there and who come from there, they also tell different stories about their New Orleans. And so it's harder to write New Orleans because it's kind of like the story of the people who try to describe an elephant without being able to actually see it, where they're just touching it. It's kind of the same way. You have to decide when you're writing New Orleans that you're going to get something wrong. Someone's going to disagree with something, but you have to decide what you are going to focus on. And I've actually been very happy because I've had more than a few people who've either grown up in New Orleans, who visit New Orleans often, who live in New Orleans now, that they've contacted me and said, you really got this city right. And most people don't, so I feel good about that. I think that somehow I did manage to get, by focusing on my sort of internalized version of New Orleans, I've touched some bits that other people sense as well.
Well, I noticed that when I was reading through The King of Bones and Ashes, the beginning there you talked a lot about the levees and the time when Katrina was happening. And what I noticed was the actual correctness of the information. It sounds like you must have gone through and done some research there.
Oh, child, listen to me. First of all, I'm the king of research. Part of what I enjoy really doing about writing is doing research. But no, there was no way. I thought, there's no way I'm going to get this wrong. First of all, because when you're writing about Katrina, and I get into this later in the book. The book starts the day that the levees fall, and then it jumps forward in time, where we meet Alice as a young girl, and when we meet her again, she's a young woman. And there's been a whole chunk of her life that's happened in between, and it's not been the happiest, most sort of nurturing life in between. But when you're talking about Katrina, it's something that really happened, and thousands of people died, and hundreds of thousands of people, they were displaced. It was a heart-rending disaster on just a monumental scale. And so I couldn't take that lightly, but I wanted to be able to start showing the life resurging again through there. But yeah, no, I address it later because, the whole premise of this series is that magic is fading. Because when I was thinking about writing witches in New Orleans, Katrina was the first thing that came to mind. It's like, okay, if there really were witches capable of controlling weather and doing these, monumental kind of acts of magic, why would a Katrina happen? And so my response to myself was it would be because they couldn't have controlled it. And why couldn't they control it? Maybe because magic is fading and they're losing their control in general. And so that's where that first bit of the book comes in, that you learn that magic is fading. These witches are losing control of their power. They've done their best, and they've almost succeeded, but still the levees fell. So later, I come back to it again when we address Katrina and what happened at the dome there, and what happened to the people there, and what, just to show, getting back to privilege again, about how that so many of the people who could afford to get out did, and so many who couldn't didn't, So that I try to take it seriously, even though I'm writing fantasy. I don't want to play fast and loose with any tragedy, especially one that's cost so many people their lives.
Another thing that is truly remarkable is your character development. How do you feel about your characters, and how were they created by you?
That's kind of a two-pronged thing. How do I feel about my characters? It's funny, the good and the bad ones and the ones in between. On some level, I know they're all aspects of myself, so I kind of have to, love them all. It's that old television show that Agnes Nixon, where she created the soap opera, and she said, well, they're all my children, Mm-hmm. That's kind of how I feel about my characters, that they're all my children. And on some crazy level in my mind, I think they all really do exist, but they're kind of like, in a way, they're kind of the characters, they're kind of actors, so even the bad ones really aren't bad. And at the end of the book, they all go hang out at the beach and relax or something, But how I create them is a very different thing. I sort of give away my process in the introduction, the first chapter of this new book, The King of Bones and Ashes, because I talk about servitor spirits, and a servitor spirit is something from what's known as chaos magic. To not get too deep into that, because you can go down a real rabbit hole there. It's a servitor spirit is an entity that doesn't exist before you conjure it, and you conjure it for a purpose. And when it's lived through that purpose, then it usually dissolves or just goes away, or you can dissolve it when you're through with it. But it's kind of like a entity who has its own mind to some degree and who functions the way you want to, but they're still independent. And so I would talk about how you create servitor spirit in the beginning of the book, because one of the characters, Daniel, is a servitor spirit, but he believes himself to be the ghost of an Irish worker who died during the building of the big canal in New Orleans during like 1800-ish. So when I describe how the witches created Daniel, the servitor spirit, I'm talking about how I go about creating my characters. And I have a little bit here where I'm talking about that, where they're discussing this, and some of the characters. First, they're looking at a painting of Daniel, and it's a way that the witches who created him visualized him, and then they go on to say that's the first step. You see, you give a servitor form, one that suggests the traits you like to have, and then you imbue it. I'm skipping a bit. With a sense of self. It works best if you give the servitor a tragic past. And injustice it can fixate on, saddling your creation with a dark secret or two, something it's ashamed of, something it's afraid you'll learn, doesn't hurt either. And that's kind of at the root of how I create my characters. I sort of build a general idea for them in my mind, and I start giving them things they want to hide from me, And they start coming alive, because my classic creation story is Gilo, who was one of the main characters in the Witching Savannah series, and she was not supposed to be in that series at all. And I'd gone for a trip to Savannah when I was in the middle of trying to get the first book, The Line. I wrote the first 150 pages like 6 times, and I couldn't get past that. I couldn't get to that point. And I went back to Savannah to try to get a little bit more inspiration, and on a guided tour where they mentioned hoodoo. And I'd heard about hoodoo before, and I read about it, but I hadn't really thought about using it in the book. And I thought, well, maybe if I just mention that this one character, that his grandmother or great-grandmother is a hoodoo practitioner, that will give it a little local flavor, blah, blah, blah. So I'm sitting down, I get to page 150 again, and I type in the name of this character. She was just supposed to be mentioned. Everyone was supposed to react like, oh, you can't hang out with that boy because his grandmother is Gilo Wills. And again, I froze. And I couldn't get further. And then I swear, I heard a voice. Yes, I am that crazy. I heard a voice say to me, boy, I know what happens next. If you listen to me, I will tell you what happens next. And I thought, okay, either I need to get my medication adjusted or I need to start typing. And I started typing, and that was Gilo. And she wrote the first 2 books. She stepped in. She went from being a non-existent character. She wrote out almost the other character. Her great-grandson, literally and figuratively disappears from the book. So he disappears, and she takes over, and she goes from being sort of the foil in the first book to the best friend and parental figure in the second book, to, spoiler alert, saving the world in the third book. And so, so this character, I was so in love with her. And when I got the chance, my publisher asked me if I wanted to do another book in that series. I'm like, yes, but I had sort of concluded that story at that point. I thought, well, I could go back and I could look at Gilo and her life when she's younger. And I thought, this is going to be a breeze because she's so helpful. She's so talkative. She's going to walk me right through this. I started writing. She wouldn't talk to me. There was nothing there. She would not talk to me. And so I struggled with this book. I missed a deadline. I turned in another book. I got that one published. I went back to this one when they finally said, you still owe us this book. And I finished the book. And after a lot of struggles and talking to a lot of people, but when I finished that book and sent in the final edits, the final copy edits, the book was done at that point. I swear, I saw that woman. She leaned back. She folded her arms and kind of smirked at me. She said, yeah, that's my story. You got it right. But she had told me, she said, I gave you 2 books. You owe me 1. And so that's how really these characters get in my own head. You know, I'm like, people go by, I'll be like arguing with them. They're like, are you okay? I'm like, I'm fighting with my characters. Leave me alone. So there's more than a little insanity in this process, but I'm fine with it.
When we were talking before this interview, I had told you the story about R.A. Salvatore and Driss Duarden, and anybody that has heard those names are saying, yeah. But literally, Driss Duarden was a character that was going to do a cameo that he was supposed to just run across the tundra and scare everybody. And the next thing R.A. Salvatore knew, he'd written 23 books about the guy.
That's kind of my Gilo. Her name was supposed to hit the page and scare everybody, and then that was supposed to be it. But no, she had different plans. So, I have another character, not quite as extreme in this new series, where she was supposed to, I needed to get one character, a major character, from one part of town to the other. And I thought, well, I'll just, have the woman Uber or Lyft, whatever, So I have this generic kind of thing for, Lyft, Uber, whatever. But this character, she started chatting right away, and she was like talking. She sold herself to me within like 5 sentences. And she went from being someone who was just supposed to drive a character across town to someone who was majorly involved with the big finale of the first book and the romantic interest in the second and third book. She took over, and I'm like, okay, girl, you deliver.
Another thing I want to say about your books is your writing style. And one of the things that I enjoyed the most was just how smooth it read. And it's hard for me to describe that any better, but as an editor, I would love to be your editor because you write so very well and so very clear, and your descriptions, you just feel like you're there. And is that something that just came to you easily, or is it something that you had to work on?
Well, I so wish I could take entire credit for that, but I work with an editor. Her name is Angela Polidoro. You'll see her name in every book just about. I worked with her except on one, which I worked with another editor named Nikki, who is also wonderful. But Angela and I are sort of, she understands me, she gets me, but she makes me look so much better than I am. So, I handed her this pile of garbage, and she sends me back something that, is like in English. And I'm like, oh.
Really?
So, yeah, no, I exaggerate a little bit. She adds so much. And I've learned, I have not studied writing. I've studied reading, but not actually the process of writing. And I've learned so much from working with her, she's one of my dev editors, and Jason, who is my main editor with my publisher. I've learned so much from them that I do think I'm becoming a much better writer, but I owe it to the process of working through the books with them, because they show me, it's like, if you do it this way, and they're always so sweet. They're like, might I possibly suggest that you, and I'm like, oh, you mean if you want me to do something that people could read and enjoy, sure, I'll take your suggestion.
Well, I got to say, it's beautiful writing. It's really well done. And I want to tell the listeners is that a lot of times when you're reading fantasy or dark fantasy, the authors get so caught up into describing the scenes that they forget to tell you about the characters, or they get so caught up into describing the characters that you don't know where they are. And you do both. Well,
thank you.
And that is rare.
For me, it's funny because everything, I do really start with character. And I think that character, when I talk about character, I also mean place. So everything that comes from that, the settings that you find them in, everything that I am describing, I try to sort of expand to show a bit more about the character through the setting, where they find themselves, what they're doing. But it's funny because I am sort of known as the king of the plot twist. And I love me a good plot twist.
Yes, you do.
I do. I caught up with the most recent episode of Riverdale today, and they did a classic plot twist. And I was like standing in front of my TV applauding as if they could hear me, But I do plot twists so often, and so I think I do a good plot twist. I think that it's probably surprising to realize that I'm not a plotter and that I'm a pantser, and I base on what my characters are feeding me. So I will go in whatever direction they're telling me is fertile. And it's a collaborative effort, me and my characters. I mean, that's how schizophrenic I am, I guess, that they really do guide me. And when you get a really good plot twist, it's because one of my characters said, hey, how about I do this? Like, ooh, good. So yeah, no, I do. I try to maintain a balance between setting and action and character. And, it's like I said, it's a big help because Angela quite often will come through and say, you might want to tell where this person is standing.
Do you have a favorite scene or story from The King of Bones and Ashes that you can tell us about that wouldn't be a spoiler?
Oh, gosh, I think probably my favorite scene is at the beginning.
I love the beginning, by the way.
Well, thank you. It's setting up sort of how Alice, who at that point is around 7.5. It's setting up how she's sort of separate from her family, how she, even though she is the youngest child of a wealthy, privileged, powerful family who, on the surface level, it seems like she would be getting a very nurturing upbringing. You find out that the only upbringing, the only nurturing she's really getting is from this servitor spirit, Daniel, who, as I said earlier, he thinks he's a ghost. He isn't. He doesn't know the truth about himself. She doesn't know the truth either. And her older brothers sneak her up to the attic that's usually locked off by both mechanical and magical means. But since everything's going to hell, quickly, this has been taken down, the magic has fallen apart, and they've sort of opened up the place to remove things. And they take her up and they start explaining to how her parents created Daniel. And it's that sort of where I got in the chance to tell how I actually create my characters. But my first editor, the editor who acquired the line, David, he pointed out to me at one point that all of my main characters are loners. And I love the way setting up that this 7-year-old girl is already a loner. And because when you see her again, she's been exiled, basically. She's been deserted by her family. And so I like the way you see her as a young girl and you build sort of like the sympathy you get for any young child. And then when you see her again as a young woman, you're kind of like, whoa, who is this person? And how does this person, what happened to her in between? What made her this person? And so sort of going back. But I think the opening chapter where she's up on her tiptoes on the second floor and the water is swirling all around, this magic holding back from her, basically her yard pretty much.
And I have to stop you and say, right there was another scene that you wrote so very well. I could envision the water there with the trees floating on top. It was amazing.
Thank you. I mean, this is it's the kind of thing they always say, kill your darlings. This is one of my darlings that survived in the book, where she's looking down, she sees 2 garbage cans, plastic garbage cans, and they're floating and they're hooked together by their wheels. And she starts sort of anthropomorphizing them and seeing them as like partners or lovers dancing. And then her heart breaks when finally they separate and the one disappears. So it was a lot of fun stuff like that. But that the opening is my favorite scene in the first book.
And I got that. that these garbage cans were characters.
Yeah, it was fun.
I think I should tell the listeners, when we were talking about Katrina, the book literally opens with this scene of what we're talking about here. I mean, it is the first thing that you find out about. It just grabs you and you spend the next 8 hours reading just because of that. Anyway, I'm sorry about that, but I just had to say that. I loved that start.
Oh, only 8 hours, not 10? Come on.
Before we leave you, can you tell us a little bit about the Savannah series? Maybe not a whole lot, but so if people are interested in that, I know it's similar to The Witches of New Orleans, but it's not the same.
It's similar in that it is written about witches, and has a lot of family relationship matters. I really stink at writing romance, so you don't really see a lot of romance in my work. What you see is sort of familial relationships and where they go wrong and where they go right. So the first series, the Savannah series, is written, the first 3 books are written first person, single point of view. It starts off with Mercy Taylor, who is a very privileged, spoiled young woman who's still really kind of sweet. She just doesn't know that she's basically a brat. And the series goes about watching her having the bit chipped away, where she goes from this self-centered young woman who she lets everyone take care of her. She even lets her aunts do her shopping for her clothes. She lets herself be treated like a doll almost. To at the end, she is her own woman. She is taking care of other people. She is standing up. So it's lighter in a lot of ways in the second series. And Mercy she's a delightful character. I mean, I love her because first of all, she's mine, but she especially I have two stepdaughters, and they would kill me if they heard me saying this, but when kids are teenagers, they're both grown women now, but when they're teenagers, you can't help but be self-centered. And so I put a little bit of that in Mercy, where, they're going to be a good person once they get through that, but you got to help them sort of push them through that. And so that's Mercy's story about how she goes from being a child to a woman and having her own child and learning how to become a nurturer instead of someone who has everything done for her. So it's fun. It's magical. It's got dark bits. It's got an entirely different mythology for magic than the second series. They are completely unrelated as far as where magic comes from, how magic is used, what magic is. I hope that people will enjoy both. The one's lighter, the one's dark. I hope you like them both.
Now, I have to be honest and say I haven't read any of the Savannah series, but I am captivated by the Witches of New Orleans. You've got a friend for life in those, I'm telling you now.
Great, thank you. I would say that if you do start the Savannah series, you can either start with The Wine, which was the actual first book, or you can start with Gila, which was the fourth book, but a prequel. You get one big spoiler if you start with Gilo, and you get kind of a few explanations. You'll understand what the older characters from the first three books, why they're behaving the way they are, which you don't get otherwise. But I hate to say this, as we talked about how I learn from my editors as I walk along. Gilo is I would say is the best book of the series because it was my fifth book. Really, it's the fourth in that series, but it's my fifth book, and I was able to learn. I was able to practice. I find that, I enjoyed writing Mercy. I enjoyed writing her first-person singular, point of view. But I tend to enjoy, and I think I'm much better at writing close third-person, multiple point of view. Some people may disagree with me on that, but it's what I enjoy doing, so I'm going to say I'm better at it since I enjoy it.
I'm with you. How can we find your books? Where are they at?
The easiest place, my publisher, 47 North, is owned by Amazon. So, of course, the easiest place to find them and probably the cheapest place to find them is on Amazon. But you can also order them through Barnes & Noble. They can order, your local independent bookstore can order them through their independent bookstore ordering service. And if they tell you they can't, say, yes, you can. But my thing, I love public libraries. So you get things where you hear about pirate things being done on the internet and people stealing the work and stuff like that, and that really annoys me. But I love for people to read my book for free. I love them to read them for free coming from a public library. So if you will make me the happiest man in the world if you walk into your local library and ask your librarian to order a copy of The Kings, Bones, and Ashes. I will be thrilled because that's how you read a free book, people.
And if we want to find out more about you, where do we go?
Go to jdhornauthor.com. That will tell you far more than you could ever possibly want to know about me.
Well, JD, I have enjoyed talking with you. It has been a pleasure. And when I say I'm a fan now.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you.
I hope you're going to come back when book 2 comes out of The Witches New Orleans.
I would love to.
When can we expect that?
That one is June 26th. That's called the Book of the Unwinding, and I have to warn you, when you find out what the Book of the Unwinding is, it is really creepy. And I was like, it's the one time I've ever written anything that really creeped myself out. I'm like, oh, God, you're a sick man. But that's June 26th, when the third book is The Final Days of Magic, and it is coming out, I think, in November or December. I'm not actually sure they have the date set yet. I'm still writing it, so I'm hoping it's December.
Well, I'm going to say you're welcome to come back. I'd love to have you come back and talk to you more about your ideas and more about you. Because we didn't get into the fact that you're a marathoner, and I'm sure you have some stories you can tell us about that. I've done 2 full marathons and like 1.5 billion half marathons. I hurt my ankle, had to have an operation. The doctor said that I can never do another full marathon because of the work they did, but I can continue to do half marathons.
since I hate full marathons and love half marathons, I'm like, oh, what a shame, Doctor. Can I have that in writing?
So we'll have you back to have you tell some stories about that. So.
Oh, great. That'd be fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much, JD. You are a treasure.
Oh, thank you.
That was a lot of fun for me, and I want to thank JD for being on the show. His book, The King of Bones and Ashes, is now available on Amazon, as is all his books. If you missed any of the links that JD spoke of, I will have them for you in the show notes. I'm currently reading his book, and I have to say I am now a fan of JD and his work. I think you will too. And now, this.
As read by. Amazing stories read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have a coincidence that is truly amazing. A listener tale that just happens to be from New Orleans, the home of J.D. Horn's newest series of books. There's no way I could have planned this, even if I'd tried. I received this email from Aaron Michaels a few weeks ago. Hello, Ron. I took your advice and I'm contacting you about my story. I was born, raised, and bleed Bayou blood. I'm a collector of stories, much like yourself, and when I was a young girl, I remember sitting in the kitchen of my Grams and listening to her telling me all manner of stories. I would like to share some of these with you. Are you interested? Aaron. Well, I couldn't reply fast enough, and I got my first story from Aaron this past week. Here is her story from the amazing city of New Orleans. I edited this one gently with Aaron's permission. It was told to her by her grandmother, and it goes something like this. Each spring, the family gets together for the biggest Creole shrimp feed that you can possibly imagine. People would come from all around town to join in the fun and games of the day. We had all manner of foods, with shrimp as the main course. And, of course, you can't have shrimp without crawdads, and they were aplenty as well. In the spring of 1962, Great-Grandpa Theodule had just passed away. He loved the yearly event, and on his deathbed he swore that he would attend. Well, he sure came through on this promise in the most interesting and spooky way. Everyone that was there swears to this day that all this really happened. Families were arriving and setting up their stretches. Each family had their own table, and it was more of a meeting spot than for eating. The idea here is that you celebrate the family and its history. Any members lost that year would have a place set for them at the table. At our family's table, Theodore's picture was set and an empty plate placed before it. The party began with music ranging from jazz to Creole classics. It is a mix of musical styles originated with the influences of Cajun, African, and Spanish music. It's very hard to describe, but fun and historic to listen to. Great-Grandpa Theodule was a bit of a Creole musician himself, and it was here that he first made his presence known. All who were at the table swear that his picture floated up and began to sway with the beat of his favorite tune. No strings, levers, or other tricks could be found, and when the music stopped, the picture dropped. It would repeat this every time one of Great-Grandpa's favorite tunes were played. No one at the party was surprised by this, and it wasn't even considered abnormal. Next came the feed, and Grandpa Theodule would not miss this. While the people filled their plates and told stories around the boiling pots of shrimp and crawfish, somehow Theodule's plate was filled with fine Creole fare. It was steaming hot and ready to eat. The family just left the plate and knew that Grandpa had made the party and was enjoying the day. Many say that ghosts had their own party, and who am I to say it's not true? The yearly event continues on today, and as I write this, we're preparing for it. I have no doubt that Great-Grandpa Theodule will have his place in line. Aaron Michaels, New Orleans, Louisiana. Wow, what a timely story, and amazing to boot. I want to thank Aaron for sharing it, and to Theodule I say, have an amazing time there this spring. To the listeners I say, if you want to share your story like Aaron did, it's very simple. Head to ronsamazingstories.com, click on the Contact tab, and start typing. That's all there is to it, and then your story could end up on Ron's Amazing Stories. Do it today, won't you? The show this time. To J.D. Horn, I say, thank you, man. You're the best. I can't wait to have you back again. Coming up on the podcast, we have a short story from 14-year-old Clarissa, and she is going to come on the show and read it herself. I can't wait. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, it's easy to do. Just head to ronsamazingstories.com, and there you're going to find all the links you'll need. We are on Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many other services. Pick one and do leave some feedback about the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.